Hello everyone, it's me, Giles with a J, the person who personally narrates this channel. Just remember, that will never change. We're on season 21 and the theme is strange and unusual, so if you have any suggestions that fit that theme, leave them in the comments. Otherwise, if you enjoy the show, slap that subscribe button, uppercut the like button, and turn on notifications. I post new episodes twice a week, a long episode every Monday and a shorter episode every Thursday. Now, on to the show. The idea of a supervillain is something generally saved for cinemas or comic book stands, rarely ever seen in real life. No, actual equivalents of a Blofeld from James Bond or the Joker from Batman are few and far between in the real world, as that kind of madness usually isn't possible to get away with for long. But occasionally there are people who can live lifestyles like that and get away with it for years. Lifestyles that involve drug running, arms dealing, planned government coups, and hired murders. That's exactly what Paul Roux was able to do, the man who started out as a simple coder, but who ended up being one of the biggest underground crime kingpins in the world. This is Monsters. Paul Roux had an unconventional upbringing, to say the least. Born on Christmas Eve of 1972 at the Lady Rothwell Maternity Home in Bulawayo, Rhodesia, currently Zimbabwe, he was flung right into a world of violence and inequality, as that was the period where Rhodesia was still under colonial white minority rule. It's even been suggested that the political climate around him would shape his own political and social beliefs as he got older, as it would also shape his willingness to commit acts of extreme violence in order to get what he wanted. One thing that would not shape him, though, would be his birth parents. They gave him up for adoption pretty quickly after he was born. His mother, Jill, was only 17 when she had Paul and didn't think she was capable of raising him, especially as his father was believed to be a soldier taking part in the country's then ongoing civil war. So Jill gave her child away to an orphanage where he waited for the next couple of months before being taken in by Paul Roux Sr. and his wife Judy. Paul Sr. was a manager in an asbestos mine in the nearby town of Mshava, but while that initially seemed like it was going to bring some stability to the youngster's life, things would be thrown into a state of upheaval again when he was 8 years old, when the LaRue family left their homeland behind following the rise to power of Robert Mugabe. That's right, given Paul Sr. and Judy were racists, the idea that white minority rule was coming to an end in Rhodesia was too much for them to bear. So they took their adopted son and their daughter and moved down to South Africa, specifically to Krugersdorp, a small city just outside of Johannesburg. There, largely seeing his South African peers as being dimwits who were inferior to him, young Paul would struggle to make any friends. He became pretty insular at that point, getting heavily into video games and computer coding, all while paying as little attention as possible to his studies. Luckily for him, though, with his adoptive father by then being a wealthy man on account of the mining business he'd started in Krugersdorp, he was given chance after chance. At one point, when police arrested his son for selling pornography, Paul Sr. was able to get the whole thing swept under the rug. And that meant when Paul Jr. decided to drop out of school at 16, he wouldn't have much trouble getting enrolled in a computer programming course at a local college. Obviously, though, being a mere programmer wasn't going to be enough to satisfy him. No, he wanted something more out of life, something he hadn't been able to put his finger on until his family took him and his sister on a trip to the United States in 1990. It was there that Paul saw an all-new way of life, one filled with opportunities that he wasn't seeing in South Africa, especially since apartheid was coming to an end. So he decided that was the world he wanted to be a part of, a world that was at the center of culture, technology, and influence, and where a white man like him could thrive. Finally, am I right? So he left his family home upon returning to South Africa, and 8 months later he departed for greener pastures. But it wouldn't be the US he'd go to first. It seemed that he had determined the UK would be a pretty good substitute. It was while working as a software programmer in London that he met his first wife, Michelle. Soon after that, Paul and Michelle would travel all over the world for work, with them spending spells in both Seattle and Virginia Beach before returning to London. But London would not be their final destination. That would be Michelle's home country of Australia, somewhere they moved to in 1995, as that would allow Paul to obtain Australian citizenship. It was there that the next stage of Paul's life began to take shape. He spent his first few years in both Sydney and Brisbane continuing to work in the computer programming world, all while getting heavily into posting on Usenet forums, spouting hateful rhetoric and basically acting like a modern-day 4chan troll. Eventually, he started developing his own software. Somewhere between 1997 and 1998, Paul created E4M, an encryption software that he would initially release free of charge online. Of course, given he wasn't making any money then, it meant his household would end up going through difficult times financially. That eventually contributed towards him and Michelle getting a divorce in 1999. Having nothing tying him to Australia, Paul moved around some more as the new millennium dawned, first to Hong Kong and then to Rotterdam, the Netherlands. It was while in Rotterdam that he got married for a second time to a Dutch woman named Lillian, with the couple going on to have 2 children together. Once he had children to support, Paul realized he needed to find a way to monetize his encryption software. That was something he did by launching a company called SW Professionals in 2000, a company that offered various programming expertise as well as customization options for the E4M software. Still though, even that wasn't enough to get Paul on his feet financially. So at that point, in order to keep his head above water, he was forced to take a job at SecureStar, a company that worked in the field of online security and data encryption. But when his bosses there found out that he was taking some of the work he'd done at SecureStar and was incorporating it into his own E4M software, he was fired and once more left to rethink his future. That only got harder when SW Professionals went under at the same time, leaving him completely out of work. But that wasn't all that was weighing down on Paul as 2002 started. That was when he also learned the truth about his parents for the first time. Up until then, while it had been an open secret with his family, Paul himself had been unaware he was adopted. Unsurprisingly, that had quite an impact on him. It may very well have been the thing that ended up giving him a new direction in life. It was allegedly upon tracking down his birth father, a man believed to be named Daryl Hornbuckle, that Paul first got the idea to enter the lucrative world of pharmaceuticals. You see, as the story goes, Daryl Hornbuckle was someone who'd been making money during those intervening years exporting prescription drugs without a permit. And while that would allegedly lead to him eventually being caught and arrested, the amount of money he was making from the whole scheme made it a risk worth taking as far as his son saw things. Or at least that's one version of the story. In fitting with the mysterious shadowy figure Paul LaRue would soon turn into, there are multiple explanations as to how he first became a prescription pill merchant, with another of those explanations being that a lawyer in Costa Rica turned him on to the idea. Whatever the truth, the end result was the same. And that was that, by the time 2004 came around, Paul had begun a new endeavor called RX Limited. Basically, that business would take advantage of a legal gray area in the United States in which it was allowable to set up websites asking people to fill out their medical history and symptoms, all for that information to then be passed on to a doctor somewhere in the country who, without actually meeting the patient in person, could prescribe them the drugs they wanted. Of course, Paul was far from the first person to take advantage of that gray area, but he was one of the most successful at it. Part of the reason he was so successful was because he set up his base of operations in the Philippines, specifically Manila, where he hired a lot of staff he'd brought in from Israel as he knew he could get away with paying them little. Really, all he had to do at that point was watch the money flow in. Sure, he would have to get legitimate doctors and pharmacists on board, but that was pretty easy to do when the money offered to them was right. It was certainly the money that convinced people like Chris Schultz, an 82-year-old pharmacist based in Oshkosh, Washington, to ship more than 700,000 pills for Paul over the course of their business relationship together. It was also what convinced Dr. Prabhakara Tampani, a New Jersey-based physician, to write up many of those prescriptions. And those two were just the tip of the iceberg when it came to all the people on Paul's payroll throughout the mid-2000s and beyond. It was quickly becoming a massive enterprise, raking in around $250 million a year, though it was one that was still technically working within the confines of the law. Even the call centers that had been set up in Manila using cheap Israeli staff, while certainly morally questionable, were all above board. That meant there were no concerns for the three people who owned the company when it came to the authorities getting involved. That's right, while Paul acted as the silent partner in the management structure of RX Limited, keeping himself largely in the shadows, the day-to-day running of the company would mostly be handled by brothers Boaz and Tomer Taggart. In fact, it was the Taggart brothers who would initially hire Moran Oz to work as the manager for one of their call centers in Manila. Moran would later become a very important part of the story. For the time being, though, he remained in the periphery as Paul, the boss he didn't know he had at the time, continued to expand his interests. No longer content with making a fortune from a multi-million-dollar pill mill, come the late 2000s, Paul started branching out into other areas, one of which involved him spending $12 million trying to secure long-term leases on a large swath of farmland in his native Rhodesia, which had by that point been rechristened as Zimbabwe following its gaining of independence from colonial Britain in 1980. Needless to say, that new Zimbabwe was not one Paul was fond of, as white rule had come to an end in the area. That was exactly why he wanted to purchase so much land. The way he saw it, if he could bring white farmers back into the country en masse using areas that had been seized from them during the Civil War, he could help return it to white rule. As he would state in a rare media interview with the Hill newspaper around that time, quote, "We want recognition that injustice was done in the past, and that land reform program corrects that." Ultimately, when it became apparent his plans were not going to amount to any real change, certainly not the removal of Robert Mugabe from power as he had eventually hoped to facilitate, Paul abandoned his dream of taking Zimbabwe back to a prior time. The same thing also happened with his plans of starting a logging operation in the Democratic Republic of Congo, something he had initially hoped would allow him to build some political influence there. But that didn't mean he returned to focusing merely on his legal activities as a prescription pill merchant. No, he began pushing further into activities that were outright illegal, activities that would soon include gold smuggling, drug trafficking, arms dealing, and money laundering, all of which would take place on a grand scale. As to why he made such a leap at that point, well, it was simply a case of him getting a taste for more power and wanting to obtain it at any cost. It's believed that somewhere around 2007, Paul came to the realization that RX Limited was only going to take him so far, and if he really wanted to be a power player, then he was going to have to venture into the underworld of international crime. Unsurprisingly then, that had a negative impact on his second marriage and led to him losing contact with not only his wife but also his 2 children. Not that that was a major problem for him, though. He was too focused on becoming the kingpin to end all kingpins to worry about that, and that push into the world of crime necessitated him adding more people to his payroll, people who could get jobs done for him no matter what they were, ranging from asset protection to intimidation to cold-blooded murder. Of course, with that kind of work, Paul knew he needed someone he could rely on. That was why one of his first hires was a man named Dave Smith. Dave Smith was a native of Northern Ireland and had spent many years prior to his time with Paul serving in the British military. Upon leaving the army, though, he found it difficult to reacclimate to civilian life. That was why he started using his skills to take up contract work and security for high-level clients, with that being what first brought him into contact with his future employer. Sure, Dave realized pretty quickly that much of what Paul was doing was illegal, specifically his move into dealing cocaine around the world in high quantities. But as long as he could get a healthy paycheck out of the situation, he was willing to look the other way and sometimes even get directly involved himself. Whenever his boss needed some dirty work done, Dave was right there to help, and he wasn't the only one. Being a man who had ins with a lot of former soldiers eager to engage in mercenary work, he was able to bring in other people. Lachlan McConnell, a Canadian soldier of fortune, Joseph Hunter, a high-priced hitman, and a former Navy soldier known only by the pseudonym of Felix Clausen. Of course, while all of those men were certainly dangerous, Joseph Hunter was a particularly terrifying figure, a man who suffered from a severe case of PTSD due to what he had seen during his time in the military. He was known to lose his temper at the drop of a hat, but even the fear he instilled in people was nothing compared to the fear created by Paul by late 2008. By then, he was already developing a myth around himself as a boogeyman of the underworld, someone who was whispered about, but who few had any personal contact with, not unlike the character of Kaiser Soze from The Usual Suspects, or Heisenberg, the alter ego of Walter White in Breaking Bad. That willingness to be the boogeyman was rarely better shown than in what he did to Moran Oz and one of his close colleagues, Levi Kugel, both of whom were in that point in management positions at one of Paul's call centers. Basically, what happened was, after seeing how much RX Limited was continuing to expand, and how much money there was in that industry for two young entrepreneurs looking to branch out on their own, Moran and Levi started talking about opening up their own pharmacy in the United States. Unfortunately for them, before their plans could take any real shape, word of their talks got back to the boss, and he saw that as a betrayal against him. Not that they thought they were doing anything wrong, though. The way they saw it, if they could open up a pharmacy of their own, then they could make more money for themselves, all while providing Paul with another place to distribute pills. That's not the way Paul saw it, though, at least not at first. He set about sending a message to make sure the whole endeavor was nipped in the bud early, a message that involved inviting Moran onto his yacht under the guise of having a business meeting with him. Once Moran was on the boat, however, things quickly took a turn for the worst as it became apparent the Kingpin was not happy about what had been happening behind his back. That was when the call center manager realized he was in major trouble. Still, he likely didn't expect he was going to be thrown off the boat and shot at by Dave Smith, someone who was there to act as security. Really, the only thing that saved his life at all was him being able to explain how the whole thing would be a win for all parties involved before he took a bullet. Fortunately, once Paul realized he was not being screwed over, he instructed Dave to pull Moran back aboard the ship. He then informed the terrified man that everything was good, but should he ever decide to cross him in the future, he would be killed. That fate would also befall him should he ever try to flee the organization, as they could find him anywhere. As Dave put it, quote, "We are like an octopus. We have tendrils all over the world." That message chilled Moran to the bone as, for the first time, he finally understood who his employer was and what he was capable of. And he wasn't the only one who was coming to that realization. By then, the Drug Enforcement Administration back in the US were also starting to figure out there was more to the owner of RX Limited than met the eye. After opening an investigation into Paul's pill mill company, the DEA had looked deeper into the man behind the operation and had seen some things that gave them cause for concern. Sure, his drug distribution antics were all technically legal, even if they were operating in a gray zone. But suspicious bank transfers made to and from him, as well as mysterious phone calls he was making to Somalia, hinted at something greater going on underneath the surface of the technically legitimate enterprise. Of course, finding anything concrete about Paul Roux was difficult at that point, as in many ways he really had turned himself into a ghost. Someone who was almost impossible to pin down in any form. But the fact that he seemed to have at least $50 million in accounts tied to shell companies like Ajax Technology and Southern Ace, and a portion of his money appeared to be going towards funding known mercenaries, including hitman Joseph Hunter, certainly raised some alarm bells and prompted a deeper investigation. Not that Paul knew anything about that at the time, though. He was far too busy with his own endeavors. So when the FBI started doing their own investigation into his business, that led to them setting up surveillance on him in the Philippines, which he was completely unaware of. Or at least he was until the feds obtained a warrant to search 10 of the call centers he owned in that country. But as was to be expected, Paul was very good about covering his tracks, so no official wrongdoing was found when those searches occurred. That was a perfect result for the Kingpin, as now, feeling like the heat was probably off of him a little bit, he was free to continue expanding his criminal empire. He would do that behind the scenes, as his call centers would serve as the public and, technically legal face of his business. Of course, drug dealing was no longer enough for him as the 2010s began, though. He was already pushing into the arms dealing business, specifically in Somalia, where he worked directly with local pirates. That was obviously the reason those suspicious calls had been logged by the DEA. And it wasn't just gun running in Somalia that was taking up Paul's energy in 2010, as he was also involved in exporting weapons to the Iranian government. Weapons that were believed to include a missile guidance system. That was some pretty serious tech that could have massive effects on the balance of power in global warfare. But even that wasn't enough for the man who was by then looking very much like a real-life Bond villain. On top of all of that, he returned to his plans to set up logging operations by starting a timber company in Papua New Guinea. The only problem with that, though, was that there was a rival company already there who had most of the business. In order to make sure they wouldn't be a problem going forward, Paul tried to have their operation burned to the ground, something that thankfully never happened. One thing that did happen, though, was the assassination of Bruce Jones, someone who had been hired by Dave Smith to purchase a ship in Turkey named the Captain Ufuk. He was supposed to sail it to the Philippines, stopping over in Indonesia along the way to pick up a shipment that contained a cavalcade of illegal firearms. Of course, the only problem with the plan was that before the ship could reach its final destination, it was stopped just outside of a port in Mariveles, 3 hours west of Manila. Once that happened, everyone involved knew they were in trouble, including Bruce, though he would state after the fact that he believed everything about the trip was legitimate. But even if he did believe that at the time, he certainly wanted to get off the ship as it was sitting moored off the coast of the Philippines, claiming that his wife was about to go into labor and he didn't want to miss the birth. So when he called his employers to let them know about the situation, they seemed only too happy to accommodate him, with them sending a yacht to quietly get him off the boat and replace him with Captain Lawrence Byrne instead. At the same time, they had Bruce carry away a number of those crates full of guns with them too, of course. That meant, once customs officials finally reached the ship and realized what was going on, he was long gone. Still, even if he had escaped with some of the weapons on board, the majority of the cargo was confiscated by the authorities, and that was something that upset Paul to no end. More so than the fact his guns had been taken, he was upset that the incident had exposed his activities to the world a little bit more. So looking for someone to take his anger out on, he ended up settling on placing most of the blame on Bruce Jones. And Bruce must have been aware of that pretty soon after, because he contacted the authorities and asked to be placed in witness protection. Before the feds could get that arranged for him, though, and before he could give any real information that would help them with their investigation, Bruce was dead. After attempting to go into hiding himself, Bruce was murdered on September 21, 2010 when, while out having lunch with his family, he was shot by 2 assassins driving past on a motorcycle. How very James Bond. But while that took care of one problem for Paul, it wasn't the only problem he was dealing with, as, unbeknownst to him, one of his closest soldiers had been stealing money behind his back for some time. That person was none other than Dave Smith. As to why he was doing that, well, it appeared that Dave felt like he was being underpaid for all the dirty work he was doing for his boss. That would lead to him doing things like selling off gold bars he was being asked to manage transportation of so that he could pay off his own debts. He was also working with corrupt police officials in order to manufacture cases against Paul in the Philippines, all with the knowledge that Paul would happily pay the authorities and, by association, him, so as to make the cases go away. Needless to say, once the man at the head of what was by then a worldwide empire of crime found out about what was going on, he was not happy. His immediate reaction was to have Dave killed. As to how he did that, though, well, there are differing stories. In one story, Dave was kidnapped while walking home from a bar and was from there placed in a shallow grave with a cell phone where he received a call from Paul informing him that that was what happened to people who crossed him. Okay, now that was very James Bond. At that point, as the story goes, he was shot dead and the grave was filled in, though who fired the actual kill shot is a matter of debate. Some have even claimed that Paul was present at the scene that night and that it was him who committed the murder. Meanwhile, others have argued that an entirely different set of events played itself out as, according to them, the murder occurred when Dave was thrown off a boat and shot at, similar to what had happened to Moran Oz. Whatever the truth, the end result was that Dave Smith was dead, and that meant Joseph Hunter would move up the ranks to become Paul's number 2 in many ways. That was a blessing for Paul because after Somas, the brand name for Carisoprodol, one of the drugs he dealt with in heavy numbers, were banned by the US government from being distributed across state borders, his business at RX Limited took a financial hit. So because of that, he felt the need to lean further into his illegal activities in order to fund his increasingly extravagant lifestyle. That was made a lot easier by having one of the most intimidating enforcers money could buy at his side at all times. It didn't matter what Paul was getting involved in by then, making plans to start a drug farm in Somalia, providing pirates with military-grade speedboats so they could kidnap rich holidaymakers from the Seychelles, then split the ransom money with him, even smuggling drugs from Mexico in order to avoid US regulations. Joseph was always only a phone call away to help out. He was even able to help out his boss in his alleged plans to build a private army in Somalia, one that he eventually planned to use to quite literally invade the Maldives in a political coup that would see him be installed into power instead. Alright, that's the most James Bond of all. Thankfully, that plan would never actually be put into action, and part of the reason for that was because whether he knew it or not, the net was starting to close in around him, with another big win for the US government when the man known only as Felix Clausen, a mercenary who regularly worked with Paul, decided he wanted out. For Felix, it was a simple choice to switch sides as, seeing what had happened to Dave Smith, he knew any of them could be on the chopping block next. So it made all the sense in the world for him to contact the FBI and advise them he was willing to act as an informant. Still though, even with a member of Paul's team looking to talk to the feds, that wasn't enough to put an end to his wave of criminal activity quite yet. Given how well he'd compartmentalized his operation, making sure no one single person knew too much about his business, it meant there was still going to be a lot of work left to do in order to build a solid case against the Kingpin regardless of who was spilling whatever beans they had. And that meant he still had plenty of time to okay further killings like that of Michael Lontoc, the general manager of the Red, White, and Blue Arms Inc. company which Paul owned after the mastermind became convinced Michael was going to betray him. Then there was Josu Ninga, the lawyer who Bruce Jones had hired to represent him before he was killed. As far as Paul saw it, there was no telling how much the lawyer knew, and that was why a hit was put out on him as well. That led to him disappearing on June 20th, 2012 and never being seen again. Basically, becoming increasingly paranoid, Paul ordered the murders of anyone who he thought there was even a chance were going to turn on him. That got even worse when he found out that Felix Clausen had seemingly disappeared off the face of the earth. And as if that wasn't enough of a stress weighing down on his shoulders, the shadowy figure was also now having to deal with the fact that, as a result of the increasing risks he was taking with distributing pills in the United States, many of the doctors and pharmacists who worked with him were starting to get concerned. After all, they didn't want any legal trouble to come their way. With the DEA really cracking down on the online pill mill business, it was getting increasingly nerve-wracking to be involved. That said, no matter how much pressure he had on him, Paul felt he was powerful enough to weather any storm. He was a man with so much influence and sway, he'd once been able to get away with assaulting a Filipino senator's daughter who'd refused his sexual advances by paying off her father. When anyone dared to do something like try and file a lawsuit against him, as one employee did when they were laid off as a result of downsizing in his pharmaceutical business, all it took to stop that suit in its tracks was a single threat towards the man's family. One person he did seem okay with letting off easy at that point, though, was Lachlan McConnell, one of the people he used whenever he had a dirty job needing to be done. As to why he let him go when others who'd tried to escape his orbit had ended up dead, well, that's unclear. One thing that is clear, however, is that Lachlan was happy to be out of the operation as he could see the writing on the wall, and that was spelling out the eventual downfall of Paul Roux. Before that could happen, however, he continued expanding his empire even further when he got into the meth trade in Hong Kong, something he did by working directly with the triads in that area. If anyone dared to try and slow down his business in that field, he would have them eliminated in swift and brutal fashion too. That was what happened to another associate of his named Joseph, who it was believed was stealing from Paul, which led to him being car-bombed. It also happened with Noemi Edior, a real estate broker in the Philippines who had allegedly done some work for La Plata Trading, one of Paul's many shell companies. She used her husband's status as a customs officer to help smuggle some goods through the customs system, all in exchange for a bribe, of course. But when she reportedly did not deliver on pushing those goods through, even after accepting the money, Paul was angered to the point that he ordered her murder too. After learning of what had happened, Paul instructed Joseph Hunter to hire a couple of men who could pose as people interested in buying a house from the real estate broker. That led to them visiting an empty property with her on June 23, 2011, where they shot her in the head. But that wasn't the only time a real estate agent felt the wrath of Paul. There was another incident that same year. That time, though, it had nothing to do with smuggling drugs into the Philippines. Rather, it was a situation where a woman named Catherine Lee brokered a property deal for him, all while skimming some money off the top for herself. It's safe to say that Catherine was not aware who she was dealing with when she did that. Otherwise, she likely would have thought twice about pulling a scheme like that on such a powerful and dangerous man. But whether she was aware of who she was stealing from or not, it didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was that Paul wanted revenge, and that was something he was very capable of getting. A few weeks later, two men claiming to be Canadian businessmen named Bill and Tony got into contact with her about viewing a house in Manila. That time, however, they didn't shoot her dead inside of a house. Rather, after viewing several properties and finding none to be suitable enough for the job, perhaps because the noise would alert other people nearby, they decided to drive Catherine out to a field in nearby Taytay instead. There they shot her 4 times, with 2 shots being underneath each eye. After that, they wrapped her body in a blanket and dumped it in the street where it would later be found by a passerby. That ended up being considered a sloppy method, which infuriated Joseph when he found out about it, as he knew it was going to bring down even more heat upon his boss. And more heat was the last thing Paul needed come mid-2011. He was well aware that both the FBI and the DEA in the US were looking into him, just as he was aware that the United Nations had gone as far as to create a report about his international activities. In fact, he even started showing up in the media every so often, albeit not by name. He was only ever referred to as a shadowy South African figure, someone who appeared to be a phantom of some kind as far as the public was concerned. Still, though, that was too much recognition for a man who liked to live life like a ghost. If nothing else, it was costing him a lot more money to keep himself out of even further trouble. Come 2011, he was paying around $50,000 a month in bribes just to protect himself. But even those bribes wouldn't be enough to protect him in the Philippines once a new leader came into power there, a leader by the name of Benigno Aquino. He was unwilling to take any money from Paul, partially because he had a connection to Bruce Jones, one of the many men who had been killed by the Kingpin. As it turned out, a close aide of Aquino's had gone to school with Joe Zuniga, the lawyer who'd represented Bruce and who had himself gone missing not long after the Captain Ufuk incident. That meant there was too much bad blood there to paper over with a few extra bills. So, realizing he needed to set up base somewhere else if he wanted to maintain the same level of power, Paul fled to Brazil sometime around early 2012. Once in Brazil, Paul began the process of moving all of his business over to South America, including his online pharmaceutical business. And that wasn't the only thing he was doing while hiding out. Now a single man once more after leaving his wife, he made a specific effort to impregnate his new girlfriend in Rio, as he believed if he had a child with a native of the country, it would prevent him from ever being extradited. As to whether or not that would have worked, well, it would have likely tied up any extradition attempts in courts for several years at the very least, so there was some method to that tactic. When his girlfriend did get pregnant soon thereafter, it looked like he was going to be safe where he was for the foreseeable future. One thing he hadn't counted on, however, was that he had a mole in his organization who was talking to the feds, and that mole was none other than Felix Clausen. After disappearing for some time and reaching out to the US government with what he knew, Felix had been contacted by the FBI in February of 2012 and asked to reintegrate himself into Paul's criminal organization so he could act as an informant from the inside. Of course, that was a very risky move given what had happened to others who had crossed the Kingpin, but Felix felt it was something he could pull off if it meant he could get a deal in exchange. So it was in April he re-established contact with his former boss and claimed he had a big money opportunity for him, one that would involve meth deals in Liberia. The way he explained it, the Colombian cartel members who were working with him needed money in order to finance the operation, and money was certainly something Paul was not in short supply of. All he had to do was pay for a clean room, some additional chemicals, and a few other items, and things would be able to get moving. Crucially, though, the end destination of that meth would be New York, something that Felix made very clear to state to Paul before anything was made official. That was because if the Kingpin was aware that any drug deal he was part of involved distribution to the United States, it meant he'd be able to be charged there. Obviously, that was not something Paul considered at the time. No, he seemed all too happy to go in on the deal despite the fact that it was being offered to him by a man who'd been AWOL for the last year. But while it might seem strange that a man as careful and as paranoid as Paul would take the bait, by then it was entirely possible that he knew the end was coming soon and that was a way for him to go out on his own terms. After all, living a lifestyle of always looking over your shoulder had to be exhausting after a while. And adding credence to that theory, he even made a phone call to his wife back in the Philippines around that time, informing her not to buy any properties with his money, only rent them, with his reasoning being that anything that was owned by him could be seized should he be taken into custody at any time. Whatever the truth of the matter, by May of 2012, Paul and Felix had arranged to have a one-on-one meeting together in Rio de Janeiro. Felix was nervous about going through with it at first, with him worrying about whether or not it would lead to a hit being taken out on his life. Still, he proceeded on as the feds were going to be listening to the meeting through a wire. Of course, that meant they'd hear all about the plan for Paul to travel to Liberia with Felix on September 25th of that year in order to finalize the supposed drug deal with someone who is in actuality a Colombian DEA informant. On top of that, they also heard about the Kingpin's desire to get Felix involved in an arms deal he was arranging in Myanmar, something the FBI had no idea was happening up until that moment. Clearly then, that only strengthened the need to get Paul quickly. That was why the subsequent meeting in Liberia about the drug deal was allowed to go ahead as planned, and once the meeting came to an end, the local authorities arrested the Kingpin. Sure, Paul made one last-ditch attempt to bribe his way out of the situation, as was to be expected. But in the end it did him no good, as he was quickly turned over to the DEA in the US, who immediately charged him with conspiracy to import methamphetamines into the country. Realizing the jig was up, Paul took what was seen as a surprising tactic by expressing his willingness to cooperate fully. In exchange for leniency, he said he'd be willing to do anything the DEA asked of him. And despite already having the man behind it all in their custody, the authorities saw that as a good chance to bring in the rest of his network of criminals too. That was what led to the authorities allowing him to sign a proffer agreement which stated that he could not be charged with any other crimes he admitted to in relation to his business going forward. Nope. Not even when he outright confessed to not just large-scale meth and coke dealing, but arms dealing, money laundering, bribery, and the okaying of 7 assassinations. All Paul was charged with was that original conspiracy to sell meth in the US. But while that might have seemed like a short-sighted move in hindsight, at the time the DEA were overjoyed as they felt confident they were going to be given credit for bringing in every major figure involved in the operation. Of course, before they could all be brought in, Paul would have to lure them. That's why his arrest was kept quiet and he was allowed to stay in touch with his old business partners, all while under DEA supervision. So when Joseph Hunter was asked to assemble a new team of hitmen for a drug deal in Liberia by his boss, he wasn't suspicious. He had no problem giving those men the rundown on what they'd be asked to do for the job, with him also explaining some of the prior crimes he'd committed in order to give them an idea of what they were in for. Unluckily for Joseph, however, that conversation was being secretly recorded, and he wasn't the only person close to Paul who was getting caught up in the large-scale sting operation that was taking place. A large percentage of his inner circle were also arrested around that time. By the time all was said and done, no less than 18 people had been indicted as a result of the Kingpin's efforts, with those numbers including not just the people responsible for the murder of Catherine Lee, Bruce Jones, and others, but also some of the higher-ups at RX Limited, like Moran Oz, who were deemed to have been aware of what they were involved in was a criminal enterprise. In the end, though, that would lead to much criticism of the DEA's methods. As it was put by Moran's lawyer, quote, "The government's use of Mr. LaRue as an informant is even more egregious here because the government had cut a deal with the principal architect and leader of the alleged criminal enterprise while prosecuting his employees. It would be as if Microsoft was a criminal enterprise and the government cut a deal with Bill Gates to take down the entire shipping department." Still, the DEA defended their position by arguing that not only did it ultimately lead to Paul LaRue being sentenced to 25 years behind bars on June 12, 2020, but it also led to 5 known hitmen, Joseph Hunter, Dennis Gogol, Timothy Van Vakias, Adam Samia, and Carl Stillwell being imprisoned and taken off the streets too. That said, there remains a pretty decent chance that, because of the deal he was able to cut and because of all of his money which remains hidden, Paul will be able to see freedom again one day. When that day comes, he may very well be able to pick back up right where he left off as the kind of criminal mastermind usually only seen in movies. As Felix Clausen put it himself when talking to Evan Ratcliffe for his book entitled The Mastermind, Drugs, Empire, Murder, Betrayal, quote, "He's still not done, believe me. That's the scary part. This guy is going to walk out again, and he's not done with business. The stashes that he has, he's not that stupid that he's going to give up everything. No." So if he gets out within the next 10 years, as he reportedly hopes will happen, it could be a case where the shadowy Kingpin is able to have a whole second act to his criminal career as a monster. One that will no doubt see him ruin many more lives in his quest to be the ultimate power broker in the world of international crime. Thanks so much for letting me tell you this story. If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave a comment. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.